On a freezing January morning in 2018, the quiet suburb of Willow Street stirred to life with the usual calmness. A few people were shoveling snow from their driveways, and others were sipping coffee inside warm homes, looking out fogged windows. Nothing about that morning felt unusual, until one of the neighbors, Mrs. Helms, noticed something that didn't sit right with her. Across the street, standing motionless on the sidewalk, was a young woman holding something in her arms, at tea. First glance, it looked like a bundle of clothes or maybe a sleeping child, but as the seconds passed, it became painfully clear that something was wrong. Very wrong. The woman was Mia Santiago, a 24-year-old mother who had recently moved into the neighborhood with her 2-year-old son, Aaden Batista. Most of the neighbors didn't know her well. She kept to herself, rarely attended community events, and hardly ever interacted with others. But today, she was outside, standing still in the freezing cold without a jacket, clutching her son's lifeless body. Her eyes were glazed over. She wasn't crying or screaming. She wasn't panicked or hysterical. She simply stared forward, like she was stuck between shock and acceptance. As Mrs. Helms approached, she saw that Aaden's face was pale, unnaturally so. His lips had turned a faint shade of blue, and his little arms hung limp at his sides. Without thinking twice, she ran to flag down a passing car and begged the driver to call 911. Within minutes, sirens pierced through the quiet morning air, growing louder as ambulances and police vehicles flooded Willow Street. Paramedics gently took the child from Mia's arms and rushed him to the waiting ambulance. One of the EMTs later told investigators he had never seen a body so small with so many signs of trauma. Aaden had visible bruises on his face, neck, and chest. Old scars crisscrossed his arms. His skin was cold to the touch, and there was no pulse. The child was declared dead on arrival at the hospital. The time of death was estimated to be several hours earlier, long before Mia ever stepped outside. Back at the scene, officers began asking questions. Mia's answers were mechanical, emotionless. She claimed Aaden had fallen down the stairs a few days ago. Then she changed her story and said he had been sick. Nothing added up. Her clothes were stained, and her hands were trembling, not from the cold, but from something else, something deeper. As officers escorted Mia to the police station for questioning, others remained behind to examine the house. The front door was unlocked. Inside, the heat was off, and the rooms were cold and dim. Toys were scattered across the living room floor, blocks, stuffed animals, a half-broken plastic truck, but they looked like they hadn't been touched in days. The kitchen sink was overflowing with dishes. Empty food containers littered the counters. There was a strange, pungent smell in the air that only grew stronger the deeper they went inside. In the bedroom, officers made their first horrifying discovery. Aaden's crib was soaked in old bloodstains. The mattress was ripped, and the tea sheets had been crudely stuffed into a plastic bag under the bed. Restraints made of shoelaces and fabric belts were tied to the bedposts. On the floor, a belt lay coiled next to a broken wooden spoon. Both were stained with something that looked like dried blood. One officer stepped out of the room to vomit. Detectives began photographing the scene, collecting evidence piece by piece. In the bathroom, they found a toddler's toothbrush with bristles stained dark red. In the trash, there were used bandages, a bottle of expired children's painkillers, and a soiled t-shirt that appeared to have been cut down the middle. But it wasn't until they searched Mia's bedroom that they found the most disturbing item, a journal tucked beneath the mattress. The journal was leather-bound, worn, and filled with entries dating back almost a year. At first, the writing seemed normal. notes about Aaden's meals, sleep schedule, and daily routines. But as the months passed, the tone shifted. Mia began referring to Aaden not as her son, but as a demon or a curse. She wrote about hearing voices, about being told that Aaden was evil and needed to be punished. She described bruising him to teach him obedience, and wrote about fasting him to cleanse his spirit. The final entry was dated just 2 days before his death. It read, "He doesn't cry anymore. Maybe the evil is finally gone." Outside the home, police had begun canvassing the neighborhood. Several neighbors admitted they had heard disturbing noises coming from the house, screaming, banging, and long periods of eerie silence. But no one had ever called the authorities. One neighbor recalled seeing Aaden once, through a crack in the door. He looked thin and tired, with bruises on his arms. She didn't want to get involved, so she said nothing. At the hospital, the medical examiner began the initial autopsy. The findings were devastating. Aaden had multiple rib fractures in different stages of healing. There were burn marks on his back, circular in shape, likely from a cigarette. He had signs of internal bleeding, malnutrition, and head trauma. The official cause of death: blunt force trauma to the abdomen and severe neglect. News of the case spread quickly. Reporters gathered outside the home, and headlines began flashing across local stations. 2-year-old found dead in mother's arms. Suspicious death of child under investigation. And police say case could be worst child abuse they've ever seen. Behind those headlines, officers and detectives were already preparing for what would be a long, painful investigation, one that would reveal even darker truths hidden behind the walls of that small house on Willow Street. For many in the community, the shock turned to guilt. They had seen the signs but ignored them. They had heard the cries but dismissed them. Now, a child was dead, and everyone was left asking the same haunting question: how did no one stop this? And somewhere, sitting alone in an interrogation room, Mia Santiago remained silent, staring at the wall, her face empty of remorse, her hands still shaking. As detectives moved deeper into the house, the horror only deepened. The child's bedroom, meant to be a space of warmth and innocence, felt more like a cell than a sanctuary. The walls were bare, stripped of any cheerful decorations. The only splash of color came from crayon scribbles faintly marked on the wall, likely Aaden's desperate attempt to express himself in a world that gave him no voice. A small, toppled-over bookshelf held just 3 books, all torn or stained. In the corner sat a stuffed bear, its one eye missing and its belly slashed open, revealing fluff like spilled guts. Every object in the room told a piece of a tragic story. The crib was too small for a growing toddler and covered in dark stains that would later test positive for blood. The mattress was stiff, water-damaged, and caved in the middle. Its sheets had been replaced by an old towel, folded several times, and stained with what looked like dried urine and vomit. It didn't take experts long to realize this wasn't just neglect. It was something far more sinister, something calculated, something monstrous. In the closet, detectives found more evidence: folded blankets with brownish stains, a pair of toddler shoes still laced up, and a plastic bag containing children's clothing, all of which showed signs of old blood and filth. What disturbed them most was the bucket tucked behind a stack of broken toys. It was half filled with a foul-smelling liquid. Based on the smell and samples later collected, it had been used as a toilet. Forensic analysis would confirm it had traces of Aaden's DNA. Investigators concluded the boy had been locked in the closet for extended periods, with only the bucket for relief. Moving into the kitchen offered no comfort. It was clear the home had been falling apart for some time. The fridge was nearly empty, containing only a carton of spoiled milk, half a loaf of moldy bread, and an open jar of peanut butter. Flies buzzed around a sticky counter covered in cereal crumbs and spilled juice. The sink was piled high with dishes, some of them blackened with rot, and the floor beneath the kitchen table was sticky with a syrupy residue. For a child of 2, there was no sign of high chairs, sippy cups, or bibs, no sign of nurturing or care. Under the kitchen table, an officer spotted something wedged against the wall. It was a small black audio recorder. At first they assumed it was a toy or perhaps an old piece of junk. But when they played it back, what they heard turned the air cold. Aaden's muffled cries, recorded over and over, whimpering, pleading. Sometimes for mama, sometimes for juice, sometimes just unintelligible sobs. At one point, a male voice, later identified as Luis Delgado, laughed and imitated the boy's crying before the recording abruptly stopped. In the bathroom, the bathtub was covered in grime. Hair clogged the drain, and the walls were stained with what appeared to be dried soap and mildew. More disturbing was the presence of nylon restraints tied to the towel rack, another signal that Aaden may have been held or cleaned forcibly, possibly during moments of punishment. Next to the sink were rusted nail clippers, a bar of cracked soap, and a child's toothbrush. Its bristles stained with something that didn't look like toothpaste. It looked red. It looked like blood. But it was in Mia's bedroom where the case fully unraveled. The room was strangely clean compared to the rest of the house. The bed was made, and the curtains were drawn open. A small lamp glowed softly on the nightstand. On it sat a single, framed photo of Mia smiling, holding a baby version of Aaden. That smile, frozen in time, didn't match the nightmare detectives had just walked through. She looked like any other mother, happy and proud. But now, that baby was dead, and the woman in the photo was sitting in a police station with blood on her clothes. Inside the drawers of Mia's nightstand were more photos. Most were innocent, from when Aaden was a baby, bathed, smiling, wrapped in blankets. But as the timeline progressed, the mood of the pictures changed. Aaden appeared thinner, sadder. In some images, his eyes were swollen or his skin bruised. One photo, taken just a week before his death, showed him crouched in a corner, his face turned away. None of these photos had ever been shared with family. They had been hidden away like dark trophies. The final piece of the puzzle came in the form of a tablet found under the bed. It had been locked with a passcode, but digital forensics easily cracked it. Inside were saved videos, voice memos, and internet searches. The search history included terms like how to discipline a demon child, toddler won't stop crying, and home remedies for bruises. Several videos were recovered, showing footage of Aaden being scolded, isolated in a closet, or forced to stand in the corner for hours, while a voice, Luis's, yelled threats from behind the camera. The data painted a horrifying timeline of escalating abuse. What began as frustration over parenting soon spiraled into full-blown torture, justified by a twisted belief that the child was not normal. The idea that Aaden was possessed wasn't just something Mia had written in her journal. It had become the central reason she and Luis convinced themselves they were right to hurt him. They believed, somehow, that they were saving him. Detectives began mapping the timeline. Neighbors reported the last time they saw Aaden outside was nearly a month before his death. Mia had told them he had a cold and would be resting for a while. Daycare records showed that she had withdrawn him months ago, citing financial difficulties. When CPS workers checked their files, there were no reports, no red flags, no warnings. A child had been abused in plain sight, hidden by silence and isolation. The deeper detectives dug, the more questions they had. Why hadn't anyone checked on Mia or Aaden? How did a child with visible injuries manage to escape notice for so long? Why had no one stepped in when they heard crying late into the night? As forensic teams wrapped up their collection and sealed the house, they knew this was not a case of neglect or poverty. This was a house where pain had lived, where innocence had been strangled by delusion, cruelty, and unchecked violence. What they had uncovered wasn't just a crime. It was a slow, methodical destruction of a life barely begun. Outside, snow continued to fall over Willow Street, muffling the sounds of the investigators packing up evidence. Across the road, neighbors stood in clusters, whispering, shaken by what had emerged from the house they had once thought was just another quiet home in the neighborhood. Inside that home, everything had gone unnoticed, until it was far too late. At the police station, Mia Santiago sat in a plain, gray interrogation room. The metal table in front of her was scratched and cold. Fluorescent lights hummed above, casting a dull glow over her face, which was expressionless and still. She had barely spoken since arriving, except to confirm her name. Her hands were folded in her lap, trembling slightly, though her face betrayed nothing. No sadness, no guilt, no confusion. Just a hollow stillness that unnerved even the most seasoned detectives. Detectives working the case took turns entering the room, asking her questions, presenting evidence, gently probing for answers. But Mia gave only vague responses. When asked about the bruises on Aaden's body, she claimed he had fallen. When pressed about the blood-stained mattress, she said he had a nosebleed. When they showed her photos of the restraints, she claimed they were for his safety. The lies came easily, too easily. But the more they questioned her, the more it became clear she wasn't just protecting herself. She was protecting someone else. That someone was Luis Delgado, Mia's 27-year-old boyfriend. He had moved in roughly 8 months before Aaden's death. Before Luis, Mia had lived alone with Aaden. By all accounts, she had been overwhelmed but functional. Neighbors said she seemed tired but friendly. A daycare worker who had watched Aaden for 6 months described him as shy, sweet, and always clinging to his mom. But when Luis entered the picture, everything changed. Mia withdrew. Aaden disappeared from public view. And the home, once barely holding together, descended into chaos. Luis had a criminal record. Nothing violent, but troubling enough. A few theft charges, several probation violations, a restraining order filed by an ex-girlfriend that was never pursued in court. He worked odd jobs, mostly in construction, and spent most of his time at home. When police checked his background further, they discovered he had once posted online about evil children, and how some aren't really kids but spirits sent to test us. The accounts were anonymous but matched his email. These disturbing posts, combined with the journal entries Mia had written, began to form a terrifying narrative, one rooted not only in abuse, but in delusion. Luis was nowhere to be found. The moment Mia walked outside with Aaden's lifeless body and neighbors called police, Luis had slipped out the back door. A search of nearby surveillance footage showed him walking casually down the street an hour before Mia appeared on the sidewalk. He wasn't panicked. He wasn't rushing. He was calm, carrying a duffel bag and wearing a hoodie pulled over his head. Detectives knew immediately this wasn't a coincidence. He had fled, and likely had been planning it. An arrest warrant was issued for Luis Delgado. Police searched shelters, motels, and even questioned his relatives. No one had seen him. Some claimed they hadn't spoken to him in years. Others refused to talk entirely. It was clear Luis had vanished into the background, possibly with help. Meanwhile, Mia remained in custody, but her silence grew louder by the day. She refused to talk about Luis, refused to admit what had really happened in that house. The only thing she repeated was that Aaden had been different, that he had something dark inside him. The psychological evaluations began soon after. Forensic psychiatrists assessed Mia's mental state. What they found was a woman fractured by trauma, isolation, and a dangerous dependency on Luis. She had a history of depression and anxiety. She had lost her mother at a young age. She had dropped out of school, struggled financially, and had no real support system. She had met Luis online, where he showered her with attention and promised to take care of her. Over time, he isolated her from others, convinced her of twisted beliefs, and slowly began to dominate every aspect of her life. The experts believed that Mia didn't start out wanting to harm her son, but under Luis's influence, she grew more detached, more unstable. Together, they built a world where hurting Aaden made sense, where punishing him became justified, where his pain was seen as necessary. Mia's mind, already fragile, became a mirror for Luis's madness. And in that mirror, all sense of reality shattered. Back at the house, forensic teams continued to uncover more evidence. DNA testing confirmed that the blood found in nearly every room belonged to Aaden. Scratch marks on the closet door matched his tiny fingernails. Teeth marks on a pacifier found in the trash suggested he had bitten down in pain. A final recording from the black audio device revealed Aaden's last moments, screaming, crying for water, and a voice, Luis's, telling him to be quiet or it gets worse. The recording stopped abruptly. After that, there was only silence. Prosecutors began building their case. They planned to charge Mia with second-degree murder, child endangerment, and aggravated assault. But they wanted more. They wanted Luis. The one who had delivered the blows, who had orchestrated the control, who had convinced Mia her own child was a threat. The manhunt grew wider. Federal agencies joined in. Tips poured in from across the state. A few seemed promising. One claimed Luis was spotted at a gas station near the border. Another said he had been picked up hitchhiking. Each lead was investigated. Each one ended in disappointment. As the weeks passed, media coverage intensified. News outlets called it the worst case of child torture the county had ever seen. A local paper ran a headline that read, "Monster in the Mirror, the Tragic." And of Aaden Batista. Public outrage exploded. Candlelight vigils were held. Teddy bears, flowers, and notes of apology piled outside Mia's house. Strangers wept for a boy they never met, a boy who had lived in shadows and died in silence. Aaden's funeral was held quietly, attended only by a few extended relatives and members of the victims' advocacy group. His small white coffin was lowered into the earth beneath a gray sky. A single balloon floated upward, released by a volunteer who had helped organize the burial. On the balloon, written in black marker, were the words, "You mattered." But the grief was far from over. Detectives, still haunted by the details, pushed forward. They believed Mia knew where Luis was hiding. They believed she had helped him escape. But without evidence, their hands were tied. Still, they watched her closely. Every phone call, every letter, every visitor. They waited for a slip, a clue, a moment of clarity, and then, 3 weeks later, they got one. A letter found in Mia's jail cell during a routine check, hidden in a library book, written in pencil on the back of a flyer for parenting classes. It read only 2 lines. He said he would come back for me. If he does, I won't run. It was the first real sign that Mia knew Luis's location, or at least believed she might see him again. Investigators now had to make a choice, wait for him to return, or find another way to draw him out. Either way, the clock was ticking. Aaden's story wasn't over, not yet. The search for Luis Delgado intensified, with the cryptic letter found. In Mia Santiago's cell, investigators had their first tangible clue in weeks. Though the note didn't contain a location or direct confession, it confirmed what many had suspected. Luis hadn't completely abandoned Mia, and she still believed he would come back. That belief became the thread detectives began to pull, hoping it would eventually unravel the mystery of his whereabouts. Task forces were deployed across the region. U.S. Marshals joined the case, bringing in their fugitive apprehension expertise. Luis's name and photo were added to national databases, with alerts sent to airports, bus terminals, and border crossings. His image appeared on digital billboards, local news broadcasts, and most wanted posters. A reward was offered for any information leading to his capture. Still, Luis remained hidden. Each day, without a new lead, added to the weight of frustration among those working the case. Then, a call came in from a woman in a small town nearly 200 miles away. She claimed to have seen someone matching Luis's description living in a rundown trailer park on the edge of the woods. She didn't know his name, but she said he kept to himself, walked with a limp, and paid cash for everything. He had recently started dating a woman there, another single mother. Her concern wasn't just based on suspicion, but fear. She had seen a young boy with bruises on his arms, and something about it felt too familiar. Law enforcement moved quickly but cautiously. They didn't want to alert Luis and risk another escape. Surveillance was set up around the trailer park. Undercover officers blended in with maintenance crews and delivery services. Within days, they confirmed the man was Luis. He had grown a beard and dyed his hair, but there was no mistaking his eyes or the slight tilt of his walk. He was using a fake name, Carlos Rivera, and had forged documents to back it up. But even with the disguise, he hadn't changed much. He was still volatile, still manipulative, and still drawn to vulnerable women. A plan was set into motion. In the early morning hours, SWAT officers surrounded the trailer. With weapons drawn and commands shouted through bullhorns, they demanded he surrender. For several tense minutes, nothing happened. Then the door creaked open slowly. Luis stepped out with his hands raised. He wore a blank expression and said nothing. But inside the trailer, officers found another disturbing scene. A woman, bruised and crying, sat in a corner holding her young son. She told officers Luis had been controlling and paranoid. He rarely let them leave and often spoke of cleansing the boy's soul. Luis was arrested without incident and transported back to the county jail where Mia was being held. The media exploded with the news. Headlines screamed of his capture. The public demanded justice. Protesters stood outside the jail, holding signs with Aaden's photo. Inside the walls of the facility, Luis remained emotionless. He didn't resist questioning, but he didn't cooperate either. He answered with short, dismissive phrases and laughed when shown photos of Aaden's injuries. His lack of remorse sent chills down the spines of even the most experienced officers. Now, with both Mia and Luis in custody, the full story of what happened to Aaden Batista began to take shape. The prosecution team worked tirelessly to gather every piece of evidence. They reviewed the journal entries, the audio recordings, the search history, and the recovered videos. They consulted psychologists who specialized in coercive control and child abuse. What emerged was a picture of a relationship poisoned by delusion and domination, one that resulted in the systematic torture and murder of a 2-year-old boy. Luis wasn't just abusive, he was manipulative to an extreme degree. He preyed on Mia's loneliness and mental fragility. He isolated her from her family, filled her head with twisted ideas about Aaden being possessed or dangerous, and used her fears to justify horrific acts. Under his control, discipline became torture. Love became fear, and Aaden became the victim of a nightmare that no child should ever experience. But while Luis had clearly orchestrated the abuse, prosecutors didn't see Mia as blameless. They argued that she had opportunities to seek help. She had taken photos. She had written journals. She had walked past neighbors and friends. She had known what was happening but chose not to stop it. Whether out of fear or belief, she allowed it to continue. The law, they said, doesn't excuse silence when a child's life is on the line. As the case headed toward trial, public interest soared. People wanted answers. They wanted justice. They wanted to understand how something so horrific could happen unnoticed in a quiet neighborhood. Aaden had been failed by his mother, by her partner, and by a system that never intervened. His story became a symbol for all the children suffering in silence. Then, another twist shook the case. A second journal was discovered, one Mia had written before meeting Luis. In it, she detailed her early struggles with motherhood. She spoke of postpartum depression, sleepless nights, and the feeling of being unfit. She loved Aaden, but she feared she couldn't be the mother he needed. It was raw and painful, but it showed a different side of Mia, a woman crying out for help, not yet broken by the man who would later twist her reality. The defense seized on the new journal, hoping to build a case for diminished responsibility. They argued that Mia had been mentally unwell long before Luis entered the picture, and that his influence pushed her beyond a point of control. They suggested that with the right support, the tragedy might have been prevented, that Mia wasn't evil. She was broken. But for many, it wasn't enough. Aaden's face, shown in courtroom photos and news broadcasts, reminded everyone what was truly at stake. He had no voice, no power, no protection. The system had to answer for that, and so did the people who allowed it to happen. Preparations for the trial continued. Experts were lined up. Witness lists grew. The judge ordered separate trials for Mia and Luis, fearing their stories would distort each other. The first would be Mia's. She would stand before a jury and explain how a mother could allow her child to die in the very place he should have felt safest. Outside the courthouse, people gathered with candles and signs. One sign read, "Justice for Aaden, never again." Another simply said, "He deserved love." Inside, behind locked doors and guarded cells, two people waited for judgment. One still convinced he had done nothing wrong. The other finally beginning to understand the weight of her silence. And outside, a world watched, holding its breath, determined not to forget the little boy who had suffered in silence for far too long. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, advocates, and ordinary citizens filled every available seat. Aaden. Batista's face, small, bright-eyed, and full of innocent curiosity, looked out from posters placed just outside the courthouse steps. It had been months since his death, but the outrage had not faded. The community had turned his story into a symbol, a reminder that behind every closed door, a child might be suffering. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. This was the final chapter in a tragedy that had stunned the nation. Mia Santiago sat quietly at the defense table. Her appearance had changed since her arrest. She looked thinner, older, her eyes sunken from sleepless nights and unrelenting guilt. Her trial was the first to begin. Prosecutors painted a vivid picture of neglect, abuse, and maternal failure. They described Aaden's last days in excruciating detail. His cries for water, the bruises on his body, the locked closet, the restraints. They replayed the audio recording, a haunting piece of evidence that made some jurors visibly flinch. The courtroom remained silent as the boy's muffled sobs and Luis's commanding voice filled the air. The prosecution argued that Mia had ample opportunities to protect her son. They showed journal entries where she described what was happening, sometimes in graphic detail. They highlighted her online searches, signs of child possession, how to remove demons from toddlers, and can toddlers be evil? Her descent into delusion, they said, was not enough to excuse her inaction. They reminded the jury that Aaden was defenseless. His mother was his only shield, and she had lowered it. The defense countered with a portrait of Mia as a mentally broken woman, crushed under years of depression, isolation, and abuse. They brought in psychologists who testified that Mia suffered from complex PTSD and had developed dependent personality disorder under Luis Delgado's manipulation. They explained how coercive control works, how abusers isolate, gaslight, and systematically erode their victims' sense of reality. Mia, they said, had not acted out of malice, but out of a distorted belief system crafted by the man who controlled her every move. They also read from her earlier journal, the one discovered after her arrest. In it, Mia expressed her love for Aaden in softer moments, confessed to being afraid of her own thoughts, and asked herself over and over, "Am I a bad mom?" The defense claimed this journal showed remorse, conflict, and a desperate cry for help that no one had heard. The jury deliberated for 3 days. When they returned with a verdict, the room fell still. Mia was found guilty of second-degree murder, aggravated child abuse, and child endangerment. She showed no reaction as the verdict was read. Some jurors cried, others looked away. Mia was later sentenced to 45 years in prison. The judge, in his final remarks, acknowledged her mental illness, but stated firmly that Aaden's suffering cannot be undone and responsibility cannot be avoided. He told Mia she had not only failed as a mother, but had allowed her son's final moments to be filled with fear, pain, and betrayal. Luis Delgado's trial began shortly after. This time the tone in the courtroom shifted. There was no attempt to paint him as a victim. The prosecution portrayed Luis as a manipulative, sadistic man who thrived on control and cruelty. They detailed how he moved from one vulnerable woman to another, gaining access to their homes and, more disturbingly, their children. Witnesses from his past relationships were called. Some broke down on the stand as they described his threats, his rage, and his disturbing interest in cleansing children. Luis remained emotionless throughout the proceedings. When asked if he wanted to make a statement, he declined. He showed no regret, no sadness, and no recognition of Aaden as a human being. Prosecutors emphasized this lack of remorse, calling him a danger to society, someone who should never be allowed to walk free again. The jury agreed. He was convicted on all charges, including first-degree murder, felony child abuse, and unlawful imprisonment. The sentence was life in prison without the possibility of parole. As he was led away in handcuffs, a woman in the courtroom, one of Aaden's distant relatives, whispered, "Rot in there." He didn't even turn his head. With both trials concluded, the community turned to healing. Aaden's story had left a permanent mark on the public conscience. Vigils were held every year on the anniversary of his death. A small memorial was erected near the apartment where he had lived, a bench beneath a flowering tree, with a plaque that read, "In memory of Aaden Batista. May no child suffer unseen." Local lawmakers pushed for legislative changes. One bill, named Aaden's Law, proposed stricter requirements for home visits by child welfare agencies, mandatory training on coercive abuse for caseworkers, and harsher penalties for knowingly allowing child abuse to continue. It passed unanimously. But for many, the healing was complicated. Some questioned how the system had missed the warning signs. Others blamed the neighbors for not intervening sooner, and some wrestled with how to understand Mia. Was she a monster, or a mentally broken woman who became a tool in the hands of an evil man? There were no easy answers. In prison, Mia began attending therapy. She wrote letters to a counselor saying she wanted to one day speak publicly about what happened, not to defend herself, but to warn others. She never saw Luis again. She asked for pictures of Aaden, but none were allowed. Her cell remained mostly empty, except for one Bible and a paperback book on grief. Luis, on the other hand, remained defiant. He was placed in solitary confinement after several violent outbursts in prison. He refused all mental health services. He told guards he didn't regret anything and claimed the world was full of weak people who don't understand purpose. Over time, his behavior became more erratic, and he was transferred to a high-security facility specializing in psychiatric evaluations for inmates with extreme behavioral issues. Years passed. Aaden's story became a case study in universities and criminal justice courses. His name was spoken alongside other victims of systemic failure, reminders of the silent suffering that too often goes unnoticed until it's too late. But his story also became a catalyst for change, a reason for people to look closer, listen harder, and act sooner. In one final act of remembrance, a children's center opened in the city. It offered support for young mothers, therapy for victims of domestic abuse, and intervention programs for at-risk families. The entrance displayed a mural, bright, colorful, filled with butterflies and sunshine, and at the center of it was a smiling boy with curly hair reaching toward the sky. Below the mural, 3 simple words were written: "You are seen."